Welcome to the Middleware Tech YouTube channel. In this series, you'll learn about POJO bean scope using SpringBoot. Let's get started.
We are next talked about that. If you remember, there is two scope is there. Okay, so that is called, generally talked about these two types of scope. One is called singleton scope, another is called prototype scope. So what does it mean by this, and what are the difference between these two scope? That we try to understand using the Spring Boot application. So let's talk about first singleton scope. Let's talk about first singleton scope. So what does it mean by singleton? Singleton means at a time you can create only one object of a class. That is singleton. You cannot create more than one object. At a time I can create, or server can create, or IOC container can create, or application context container can create only one object, not more than this. Right? So if application context container can create more only one object, if application context container can create only one object, that is called a singleton scope. Right? Right? So how I can define it, like if multiple requests come, then application application context container can create application context container can create only one object. If multiple request comes, then application context container can create only one object. That is called singleton scope. So how it is, that we see here. Now see, in this example, have you defined anywhere any scope parameter? No. So if you are not providing any scope parameter, then you have to remember that by default, Spring Boot application support singleton scope. Okay, there is no parameter of a scope anywhere, right? So you have to remember, by default, application context container or your Spring Boot application support singleton scope by default. How I'll prove it. By default, Spring Boot application support singleton scope. By default, Spring Boot application support singleton scope. How it is? Now, if this is your demo application, now here this is your class. Now, what you want is that I want to start the server. There is two phases. So object created. How many object gets created? Let's see here. I am this is one client request, right? Okay, let me disable this. I told you that object created. Application context container is creating the object, right? So when application context container is getting the object, when client request comes or when server start? Let me check. Right click terminate, clear. Let me check. Right click run as Java application. I'm starting the server. See here, I'm starting the server. Now see here, when I've started the server, that time object is created. When I've started the server, that time object is created. Correct? I'm talking about singleton scope. So singleton scope, two scenario. Server started, server started. Another is client request comes. So when object created, I'm talking about object creation. Object creation. So when object created, server started or client request come? Yes, when server started. Yes, we can see when server started, at that time object created, right? Now, if you see here, when the server started, that time object created, not when client request comes, right? So this is happened in case of singleton scope. That happened in case of singleton scope. When server started, that time, object created, not when client request comes. That is one point. Another one, so assume client request is coming. And assume client request coming 3 times. Client request comes 3 times. Assume this is E1 and this is E2. So assume client request comes 3 times. So if client request comes 3 times, so object created 3 times. Let me check. Right click, run as Java application. See here, when client request comes 3 times, sorry, this is, I have to just terminate, then once again I have to start. Clear. Right click, run as Java application. See here, when client request comes 3 times, then also object created only 1 time. When client request comes 3 times, then also object created only 1 time. Correct? Right? So that is the thing, that is the point, that is the concept of singleton. How many times client request comes? Object created only 1 time. Right? That is the concept of singleton, right? And it is working fine. There is no problem. Singleton means if multiple requests comes, then application context container can create only one object. By default, SpringBoot application supports singleton scope. Correct? But what happened in case of prototype scope? This is about singleton scope, whatever we talked about. What happened in case of prototype scope? Let me talk about. So what you find, your SpringBoot application by default support singleton scope. No, I want to define. You have not defined singleton anywhere, right? You have not defined singleton anywhere. In this example, whether you have defined singleton anywhere, nowhere. No, I want to define the singleton. Let me just go into just here. Just opening the Eclipse. Assume I want to define singleton manually. Now, when you create any Spring Boot application, by default it supports singleton. But how I'm going to define whether it is a singleton or not? Define that. Right. So let's just here. If you see, you can define using a particular attribute called a scope. A scope singleton. Okay. Now, if you see here, when talking about the singleton, you can use this parameter to define any particular attribute is singleton or not. How? Control V. Add that scope singleton. You can use this into the class level using annotation. Singleton. As I told you that singleton scope by default it is singleton. You define it or not define it. If you define, does not matter. You can define, no problem. Control C for your class. Just now you created the class, right? For your class employee, you can just define the scope as a singleton. Control S. That's it. Now just see the same thing. There is no change because by default it is a singleton only. It will get only one object. Right click, run as Java application. Correct. It's getting only one object. How many client request comes? How many client request comes? It will get only one object. Right? Fine. Next is that we're talking about prototype scope. So what does it mean by prototype scope? Prototype scope means if multiple requests come, then application context container will create multiple objects. That is prototype scope. What does it mean by prototype scope is that if multiple request comes, then the application context container can create multiple object. That is prototype scope. Correct? Okay, now can create multiple object. That's it. So how I can define prototype scope? It is not by default prototype. You have to define prototype. So you can write a scope prototype. Control C, Control V, scope prototype. Scope prototype. How we are going to define the scope prototype? Control C in the class employee. Just write it here, prototype. Control V, Control S, Control Z. Yeah. So I've defined prototype scope. So what I'll do, let me check when the object is created in case of prototype scope. Now I'm talking about prototype scope. I'm talking about prototype scope. So when the object is created in case of prototype scope, when the server will start or when client request will come. Let me check. I have defined the corresponding scope as the prototype scope. So if we start the server, let me just right click, terminate or disconnect all. Right click here and starting the server. Right click, run as Java application. So when you start the server, and if you go down, you can see here no object created. See, there is no constructor is called, right? That means what? In case of prototype scope, application context container is not creating any object when you start the server. No constructor is called. Correct. So if you want to map this scenario, then you can see when the object created, Control C. In case of prototype scope, this is in case of application context scope, singleton scope. So what happened in case of prototype scope? See here, when the object created, server started or client request comes. So for server started, no. So let me check object created when client request come or not. Let me check. So what I want to do is that I'm just making it enable. I'm taking about whether object created when client request comes or not, Control S, right? Fine. So what I'll do, once again, I restart the server, right click, run as Java application. See here. Now the client request came. See here, server started and client request came. So when client request came, that time the object created. How many client requests came? That number of client object is created. That means if 100 request is coming from the client, then total 100 object is created. How many client request is there? That much of object will be created. Correct. Right. Okay. Now, right now here. So this is about prototype scope. So yes, this is like this. So this is the difference of singleton scope and prototype scope. So this is the difference between singleton scope and prototype scope. Right? So in case of singleton scope, object created when server started. In case of prototype scope, object created when client request comes. That is the difference. So we already know about this difference in Spring framework. So today we'll try to execute the same thing using Spring Boot application. Same thing only we try to check using Spring Boot application. Right, fine. Okay, close all. So this is a demo. Next